Thank you all for coming and coming on time. I'm told there may be some more people coming. This is going to be a very, very interesting discussion. I don't know how you feel about this. I mean, I'm an expat. I've lived here for 25 years. I go back and report from time to time, but for the BBC World Service. So I have a different hat on when I go back. And I don't know about you, but I'm confused. I mean, I'm about these midterm elections. Less than 2 years ago, Barack Obama was elected President of the United States. We all thought, offshore, and I think a considerable number of people onshore in America thought this was the beginning of some kind of new style of politics and a new era in which labels would be shed and new understandings about American politics would come to the fore. And here we are 2 years later, and the Obama presidency, while I don't think it's any less popular than most presidencies are 2 years in, nevertheless is perceived as being something of a failure. The Republican Party is insurgent and is, at the moment, predicted to probably take control of at least the House of Representatives in 6 weeks' time. So I'm confused, and I'm hoping that the panel here can help me make sense and help you make sense of the current state of American politics. And it's a really good panel. To my left is Professor Thomas Mann, who's the W. Averill Harriman Chair and Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, and he is the co-author of The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. And he's been brought here courtesy of the American Embassy, and we say thank you for that. We hope that budget cuts don't prevent this kind of scholarly interchange. Further along to my left is Bill Barnard, chairman of Democrats Abroad, UK. He's the former chairman of the Department of History at the University of Alabama and the author of Dixiecrats and Democrats, a study in particular of the Democratic Party and its various schisms in the years immediately following the Second World War. Then, just to my right, is Dr. Thomas Grant, who's the chair of Republicans Abroad UK. He's a fellow of Wolfson College, Cambridge, and was the author of an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in the spring. In a very important case, the court decided, and perhaps it will come up during the course of this discussion, that relates to how election campaigns can be funded and just how much money can be put into them, most of which finds its way into what some people call advertising. Others would say is pure propaganda on behalf of one party or another. And then all the way along to my right is Professor Robert McKeever, who's Dean of the Faculty of Law, Governance, and International Relations at London Metropolitan University. And his particular area of interest is the US Supreme Court. And he's the author of Raw Judicial Power with a question mark, the Supreme Court and American Society. So that's the panel. And what I'd like to do is just turn immediately to Thomas Mann, who got to town on Saturday and who has lived through this splendid experience of last week's Republican primaries. And I think I'm going to ask Tom to just start by giving us a summary of the situation 6 weeks out from these midterm elections.
Michael, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Present a couple of days, and I've discovered there's complete and utter fascination with the Tea Party in America, and the likes of Christine O'Donnell, Carl Palladino of New York, Sharon Angle. One wit said that the Republican field of candidates is beginning to look like the bar scene in Star Wars, and there's some truth to that. You know, the last round of primaries, Michael, in its most specific way, made it less likely the Republicans will take control of the Senate because O'Donnell is colossally unqualified and scary. And most people in Delaware realize that, and the odds now are a seat that was expected to go Republican will indeed stay Democratic. But As far as the rest of that day and the Tea Party more generally, I think it's fair to say that in these November elections, they will be an advantage for the Republicans in helping to generate higher turnout, sort of mobilizing people, translating the enthusiasm of the out party, you know, the party that feels betrayed and angered and cynical about the team in power. But in the long haul, they are very problematic for the Republican Party. This is a very large, inchoate group of groups. The legitimate Tea Partiers are radically decentralized networks that pride themselves on being leaderless, but others are like the Tea Party Express, which endorses candidates. It frankly is a function of a Republican consultant who made a lot of money. There are other groups like Freedom Works that call themselves Tea Partiers, but are, in this case, Dick Armey, a former majority leader of the House's long-standing organization. But it's significant because it reflects, as has happened so many times in American politics, a sort of segment of the electorate who feel as if their government has been taken over by elites who act in defiance of the Constitution and grow the government well beyond the conception originally embedded in the Constitution. So that group is there. They're contributing to this. But that's not why the Democrats are in trouble. Yes, it's true. The paradox of American politics is Barack Obama has been one of the most successful presidents in modern American history in terms of his achievements under very extraordinarily difficult circumstances, especially in the Senate and with the unified Republican opposition. His legislative record is really quite extraordinary, but you could argue he's been a political failure because of the decline of the Democratic Party and the upcoming election and how it appears to be. But I think it's very important to recognize that while I can give you 7 reasons that people in the states talk about as errors made by Obama. He swung to the left ideologically. He didn't have the right priorities. He turned the stimulus over to Congress. I didn't know he owned the stimulus. The Congress legislates back home in Washington. He failed in his communications effort. He didn't deal tactically well with the Congress. All of that is, you know, a speck of truth, but the reality is that what has always happened in American politics to the party in power, when times are bad, when people are really scared, really discouraged, they don't see us breaking out of a difficult situation. At a midterm election, they take out their discontent and anger against the party in power. That's the Democrats. Republicans are very unpopular. Their ratings are lower than Democrats. This is a simple referendum election that will possibly produce a Republican majority in the House, although very likely in the Senate.
Right. I'm going to stop you there and turn over here to the other Tom and ask him. We've just heard this Tom talking about it's an advantage for the Republicans, the Tea Party. But what I'm really curious to know is, do you think the Tea Party really is that different than the Republican Party? Is it an insurgency, or is it your grassroots under, say, a rebranded name?
Well, I think that's one of the big questions. I think, thank you, Michael, for having me on the panel, and thank you, Tom, for your remarks. I think both parties see the Tea Party movement as a movement of opportunity. I think Democrats see it as an opportunity to convince middle-of-the-road voters that the Republican Party is too extreme. I think we Republicans see it as a sign of energy and grassroots enthusiasm, and therefore, for our party, it's an opportunity as well. The question is, which narrative is going to prevail in the election? Who's going to get the message across? but it's not just about storytelling, it's also about the underlying reality. Times are difficult for a lot of people. There is a lot of angst in the American electorate about the jobs situation. You have news that the recovery has been underway now since the end of 2009, but you still have states with really sharp unemployment, so people naturally are looking for a change. Yeah, I think there is a referendum aspect to it, but you know, one of the truths, one of the fundamentals of American politics is we have two parties. And that's actually rather remarkable for a country of continental size, 300 million people, $14 trillion economy. In order to win, the party really has to become a coalition. Tom used the phrase sort of inchoate groupings. But I think it's almost inherent in the American political system that a party, if it is to succeed, is going to have some element of patchwork, some aspect of bringing together groups that really don't make sense together in a strictly ideological sense. Why should social, liberal progressives on the forefront of societal change be working with old-fashioned labor unions? Why was it for the years when Bill was studying the Democratic Party that the old agrarian Southern right-wingers were working together with Northeast liberals? So that type of alliance seems to be something inherent in the American party system. Are we seeing that again? Well, I think the Tea Party movement shows that the Republican Party can very much bring in quite disparate groups. One of the things that's...
Well, let me just interrupt you there, Thomas. You say bring in.
Sure.
It seems to me that they've always been there.
I think the challenge when you look at Republican primaries is whether a sort of, if you take a candidate who's not been endorsed from the center. The Republican National Committee, for example, had a number of preferred candidates that did not win. And instead, people whose names were not yet familiar on the national stage ended up taking the nomination in various races. But we've seen, I think we're seeing that the Republican voters and the Republican activists who had already been there are fairly happy to cooperate with the newcomers, and the newcomers are fairly happy to cooperate with the party. You haven't actually seen too much third-party movement or movement toward independent candidacies. I think that's pretty telling.
Pretty telling that in fact, the Tea Party, with that name, is really part of the broad embrace of the Republican Party, as it has been for some time.
I think that's a fair characterization with the understanding.
The rhetoric may be different, but the ideology, such as, we don't think of ideology in terms of America. That's a Marxist-Leninist concept to have an ideology. But you know, there is an ideology behind the Republican Party, which is actually much clearer, I think, sometimes than what's behind the Democratic Party. Why is that, Bill? And is that causing troubles now as the party? You know, you're governing, and then you have to now go out and win a bunch of elections. When do you stop governing when do you put government on hold to go out and win elections?
I just want to echo one thing that Tom said, which is that the students of the American Congress universally agree that it was a remarkable achievement legislatively the last 18 months. Politically, it doesn't pay off, and it will not pay off until the economy turns around. I think the Tea Party movement is a political twitch. It's a political impulse. It is not a movement. It is a phenomenon that lies under the surface of American politics throughout American history, whether you go back to the founding revolutionaries or to the Jacksonians, to the Know-Nothings in the 1850s, to the populists in the Middle West and the South in the 1890s, to the 1920s, including groups like the Klan, and on up through Father Coughlin in the 1930s, and the Birch Society in the 1950s. That impulse has always been there. People who feel that somehow or another they're losing status in their own society, their government no longer reflects the kind of America that they knew or they thought they knew, they think they knew when they grew up, no longer reflects the values, the outlook of people like themselves. And in a period of great demographic change that we're experiencing now, it's not uncommon that you would have that phenomenon rise up. One of the things that worries me a bit about the strength of the Tea Party movement, especially in this coming election, is that we've had these movements appear in different times, in different episodes of American history before. Sometimes they've appeared when cultural issues, social divisions, have been dominant, have been the ones that people decided to vote on, that people felt deeply about and articulated through their votes, their sentiments. We've had other times when a populist sentiment has been expressed largely in the economic dimension, in economic hard times. What we have this time is a combination of those two coming together at the same time. The great cultural divisions and social issues that are out there, along with an economic crisis. And that makes, it's a bit like the financial crisis that we face. There are those who point out that we've faced recessions before, and we've gotten through them. We've faced financial crises before, often without a recession, and often with very little impact on the larger economy. But when they both come together, to deal with them successfully is much more difficult, the recovery is much more slow, and it's much more fragile. So too, it seems to me that when you've got this combined resentment and frustration, the American people are angry, they're frustrated, they've lost a good deal of equity in their homes, they've lost values in their pensions and their 401 plans, they've lost tuition plans for their children to go to college and university. There are all kinds of economic factors impinging upon them. They'd like to shake their fist and send a message to the bankers, but there's nothing they can do. They can't get to the bankers, but they can get to the politicians, and they can send a message. And I think that's what you're seeing. It's a political twitch to send a message.
So are you saying that the Democrats are in a kind of existential bind? There's very little they could do to stop, as Tom says, the projected loss of the House of Representatives. Because of these conditions that you just outlined? I
think there are some things that can be done. I'm not talking about the wingnuts. Those are there, and there's nothing you can do to reach them. But the more moderate people, the people who, in times of frustration, will sometimes drift in that direction, they are reachable. And they're reachable on certain issues, particularly economic issues. And the current issue over the taxation, the extending of the Bush tax cuts, whether it's limited to those that affect the 97% of the American people or those that affect 2 to 3% of the American people. That's an issue that Democrats can use, I think, and even in the short time we have, to lessen the impact of the losses that are going to come.
Okay, I want to bring Robert McKeever in on this. Is there a center that remains in American politics? I've been looking at some of the most recent polling, and it seems to be dwindling by the day. You know, you get these results of 45% say, I think this, and 46% say, I think that, which leaves a great big 4% undecided. Is my math correct? So, close to it. As you observe from over here, the center gets a lot of service. I mean, last year when I was making a documentary on the healthcare legislation for the BBC World Service, the whole process took an extra 6 months because the center, or people who said they were in the center, in the Senate, had to be courted. Does the center exist anymore in American politics?
No, I don't think it does, or at least it's a diminishing center. And I think there are some good reasons to explain why that's happening. And it's just following on from what our last speaker said. And I agree this Tea Party phenomenon is a primarily economic and populist phenomenon. But I think there's something different now about this situation. And I was just thinking today about this conversation this evening. It seems to me that back in America's been in a bad situation before. It's been in a bad economic situation, and don't forget 2 wars, which are pretty inglorious the way they're working out. It's the least you could say. But in 1932, along came Franklin Delano Roosevelt with some sort of quasi-Keynesian policies and selling an optimistic program, and it worked. It took a long time in World War II to make it work completely, but it worked. And then when you had, let's say, the end of the 1970s, when Jimmy Carter famously and foolishly said that America was suffering from a malaise, and then on came Ronald Reagan with a message of optimism, with a message this time of supply-side economics. So here was a new toolkit that was going to fix the problem. And then after that, it doesn't really work for very long, and so George H. Bush gets into trouble, and along comes Bill Clinton. Now, his toolkit is a kind of middle way, third way, moderate Democrat thing. But that doesn't work either. And one of the things I think which is really important about the Tea Party is that what a lot of people don't appreciate is that although the American economy boomed in the 1990s, blue-collar and lower-middle-class workers were no better off at the end of that than they were at the beginning of it. So the increased wealth in the economy was not dispersed anything remotely equally. So then you have George W. Bush comes in with ideas like, well, if we give the rich enough tax breaks, there's going to be a trickle down to the poor, but that doesn't work. And then finally Obama comes in. It's kind of back to FDR, 700 billion invested into it, and that doesn't seem to have worked either. So there is anger out there at the condition, but there is also a frustration, and I think a lack of intellectual coherence in either party as to what they're going to do next to ameliorate the situation.
Before we throw it open for general discussion amongst us, don't wait on me to call you. I mean, everybody's taking assiduous notes here, especially Tom. So, just feel like if you feel like jumping in, don't wait for me to call you.
Let me just add one thing to what Robert said. Then it's true that the average wages, average income of middle-class Americans, of average Americans, has not increased over the last 20 years. However, there was one difference in the 1990s, and there were 23 million jobs created in that 8-year period of the Clinton administration, whereas there were no net jobs in the Bush administration. So while you've continued to have, in the U.S., as in other advanced democracies, a stagnation in middle-class increases in income, real income. That's true for the U.S., it's true for other developed countries, but there was a great expansion in the job availability in the 1990s that we didn't have.
But the gap between the wealthy and the poor got larger, just as it did in the UK.
As it is in all advanced countries.
And another thing
exactly.
is that when we tried to figure out earlier this year what kind of government and ideology we wanted in Britain, we couldn't make our mind up, and so we have a coalition government.
And no one knows what the real answer to the problem is.
Yeah.
I mean, I think economics over an extended period of time and domestically and globally account in part for our developments, but they have their own unique seeds as well. The ideological polarization of the parties had seeds planted in the 1960s, and the counterculture and the reaction to that, the Voting Rights Act, the abortion decision, Prop 13 in California, the anti-tax movement, the emergence of Ronald Reagan, and soon you began getting a sorting process in the electorate where conservatives were finding their way to the Republican Party and liberals to the Democratic Party. The old liberal Republicans disappeared from the scene, and there were fewer and fewer of the traditional Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party. This has grown over time with the dynamic between leaders, elected officials, and the public. Now in America, people are making geographical decisions, where to live based on finding like-minded people who share their values. And so we have clusters of conservative and liberal or moderate districts. Parts of the country. This had a profound effect. Also, the narrowing of the disparity between the majority and minority, the partisan parity has increased the stakes of competition, which has unleashed a permanent campaign in Congress, and the kind of policy making that we used to see occurring across party aisles, building coalitions, has now given way to sort of separate partisan blocs rooted in ideological differences, but because of the quest for power going much beyond that, so that now a minority party, opposition party, does nothing but oppose, and they have a filibuster in the Senate to help them make that.
I would agree with Tom that there's been a historical trend toward greater polarization. If you look at the competitiveness of House races going back to the 1950s, there were more competitive races when it came to general election day, the first Tuesday in November, than there were before. And there's actually been a trend toward the actual Democrat versus Republican races in any given congressional seat becoming less competitive, so that in fact the only races that matter are the primary campaigns, and that means what you've got to do if you're a candidate You sit down, you ask yourself, who do I have to convince? You've got to convince people in your own party that you're more Democrat than the next Democrat, or you're more Republican than the next Republican. And I think that's an institutional problem as well as an ideological problem. You've had these demographic changes that Tom refers to, people moving to a neighborhood because they think it's the right sort of place to live, but you've also got a system of defining the boundaries of congressional districts, which is actually sort of an outlier in the Western world. Most countries, including this one, have a more neutral approach to deciding where your constituency borders are. Nobody has a perfect system. Ours is an extremely imperfect system.
There's a lot of Ulstermen living in the United States. Send it to Captain Gerrymander, and they can't get enough of it. How would you describe yourself? Would you consider yourself a moderate Republican in the traditions that Tom was talking about the other day, or do you see yourself as a modern Republican?
Well, look, I mean, I'm a Massachusetts native, and my home state Senate seat was held by a guy called Scott Brown before he got a job promotion. And I think actually his politics represent those of many people I know from where I came from in Massachusetts. Now, whether that would play well in South Carolina, well, I don't know South Carolina well enough to say, but I would guess probably not. So there are a lot of different faces to the party. I think that there's been, I mean, it's an interesting thing to say that the moderate part of the party has died away or gone away. But I mean, I think there's still a lot of people who are primarily concerned by taxation, economic issues, regulatory issues, and that is really a critical part, a central part of the Republican Party. And I think when push comes to shove, it's those sorts of issues that my party can win on and has won on. And the more divisive issues, well, you know, there have been periods where those have worked, but other periods where they haven't.
Can I just say on that, I don't know whether the audience is familiar with the term being used by the Tea Party and the sympathizers as rhinos. Anybody heard that? Rhinos? R-N-I-N? Republicans in name only. And one of the interesting things about the Tea Party is that they are attacking some mainstream Republicans, some of the people they're opposing, and therefore this is not just an anti-big government, well, it is anti-big government because some of the Republicans are just as bad as the Democrats at the pork barreling and so on. So, you know, there is a kind of a threat within the Republicans which might divide.
But, you know, just jump in quickly again as a follow-up. Much of the concern amongst the Tea Party activists has been with really long-term incumbents. There was a hue and a cry. There was a great amount of hair pulling when the incumbent Senator Bennett from Utah was unseated. Now, I think he was going on 80, and a 6th or 7th term. Wow, that really is an entrenched elite if ever there was one. It wasn't always that way. If you go back 50, certainly 100 years, there was a lot more turnover in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. So I think you've got to take with a bit of a grain of salt the idea that they're on a warpath against a particular ideological brand. They're also looking at these people who've just sat there in Washington a very long time without doing much and saying, hey, how about someone new?
Term limits has been so common amongst Republican insurgents for 40 years. And then as soon as they get elected, it's amazing how quickly they say, you know, seniority isn't necessarily such a bad thing. I get that committee chairmanship, I get extra staff and all that stuff, and it's quite good. And I imagine, if Miss O'Donnell wins, I know she's going to just really enjoy the perks of the Senate if she manages to pull it off.
This woman has not had a job paying more than $5,000 a year, so I think this will be seen as a real promotion, Michael, and she'll not want to leave it. I want to challenge Tom a little bit because his argument implied that the conservatism is on the social issues side and that the Republican Party is sort of in the, if you will, in the center, sensible thinking moderate Republicans on economic policy. But I would sort of argue that that isn't true anymore. Now we have the ideology of tax cuts. Mitch McConnell can get up on the floor of the Senate day after day and say we must extend the Bush tax cuts. we must do something about Obama's deficits and debt and get rid of them, and we must cut government spending. I mean, it just doesn't add up at all, and that's one of the problems that we face now. The Republican Party has aligned anti-tax groups, and it's become the center of the party. But Wayne, Warren, Rudman, and a host of Republicans who cared about fiscal responsibility are utterly appalled by the fact that the modern Republican Party cares not a whit for that.
Can I just stop right there? We'll pick it right up. Just a quick bit of demographic research. How many people here are American? Right.
Both ways.
Both ways. So how many people understand the basic argument that Tom is just making, that Mitch McConnell, who is the Republican leader in the Senate, has been saying the Bush tax cuts are due to expire, what, December 31st?
Right.
On December 31st. The debate in Washington at the moment is, do you extend them for the middle class, who are hard-pressed in these economic times, but cut them on the top 3% of earners, so that starting December 31st, all those bankers on Wall Street who are going to get their 7, 8, 10-figure bonuses actually have to pay a considerable amount more in tax.
Going back to the Clinton rates, which
Going back to the
high.
Clinton rates, exactly. Now, so we understand what the debate is, and what you've got is Mitch McConnell, who at the moment is taking that Republican line, which has pretty much been their default setting. Default is a pejorative word, Tom, but you know, it is true that just say no, which used to refer to drugs, has become the essential way of doing business, so long as the Republicans are in the minority. That is a strategy, and it's been, let's face it, it's been effective because, you know, Tom says Barack Obama's legislative program so far in almost 2 years is pretty successful, yet the perception in the country is that he's failing because the Republicans say no, and this has been railroaded past us, and he won't engage in bipartisanship, and so on. So that's my parenthesis. But we can go back to the point now about taxes, because it is important, because I think that one of the key things that the debate at this midterm election is that there are very substantive economic issues that should be under discussion, but it all tends to be subsumed into more emotive stuff, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for one thing, I mean, elections are often fought on sentimental grounds. Your message has to be in a package and in terms that get people excited. But I think, you know, the failure, the fact that people are not applauding or President Obama's legislative successes has to do with the fact that those successes haven't actually translated through to higher wages, higher levels of employment, and a sense that the economy really has turned around. And that's a major problem. You can say that it's, the president can say that he's done all sorts of things that have worked, and things that were on his checklist that he wanted to get done may be done. But if the country as a whole doesn't feel that things are moving forward and that the pocketbook isn't fuller, that's really a problem when it comes to the next election.
I think the Democrats have not done a very good job of selling what has indeed been done and been accomplished, and what the academic economists say has been done as a result of the stimulus. But I want to go back and pick up on a point, a more general point, really, that both Tom Mann and Tom Grant made about the growing partisanship and the growing fractionalization of American political, the American political system. And it's perhaps appropriate, being here in the Frontline Club, to talk a bit about the role of the press and media in that phenomenon. While there are certain aspects of redistricting and all the rest which do indeed reinforce it and are unhealthy, nonetheless, one of the things that struck me when I first started coming to this country in the mid-'80s was that I would run across young people, young men and young women, who had not had a great experience of the world, and they had a wide familiarity with different kinds of music, much more so than a young person of the same age in the U.S. at that particular time would have had. And I was always curious about that. And then all of a sudden I realized, well, you know, until very recently, they had only 1 or 2 radio stations. And the radio stations played different forms of music throughout the day: classical, folk, country, rock and roll, whatever. So you were listening to the very few number of radio stations, and you were getting an exposure to a wide range of stations. Well, that's changed in this country, obviously, and now if you are a country music fan, you need to listen only to country music all day long, just as you can do in the States. Not quite true here, but that's true in the States. But you can listen to whatever brand of music you prefer, and that's all you ever hear, and you're never exposed to anything else. That's happened to the American media as well. We no longer speak, the great broadcasting networks are not what they were. And not everyone tunes into one or two of the national network news programs at night and gets a reasonable summary of fairly factual, fairly straightforward news. Rather, you can tune in, if you wish, to Fox and get one version of what's happening in the world, or perhaps to MSNBC and get a version of what's really happening in the world. But the point, and the internet's even made it even worse, because you can type in and read the websites of only those who agree with you, and can feed you all kinds of information which may have nothing to do with reality. And it poses a question, I hadn't thought of it before, but it poses a question that the United States is a peculiar kind of nation. It was founded on a set of ideas and the values and the rest. It was not one ethnic group that descended from the sun or whatever. It was not one religion. But it was a set of ideas, a commitment to a set of ideas and values that made the country, that tended to unite it. And if we are so fractionalizing ourselves today, as I think we are politically, it poses some long-term questions about how effective our government can be.
Let me just ask.
I just want to follow up on this point of partisanship. I mean, it's absolutely true that all the evidence is that there is a much fiercer bipartisan, non-partisanship or partisan enmity. What is the influence of the Tea Party going to do to that? It's going to make it even worse.
Right. Right.
So you're going to have, if the predictions are right, you're going to have Obama with a small majority of Democrats in the Senate. So the Senate's not going to work for Obama. And you're going to actually have a Republican-controlled House of Representatives. So clearly that's not going to work for Obama. But even worse, you have the Republicans coming under pressure from Tea Party types, assuming they're successful, perceived to be successful. So that partisanship is only going to get worse over the next couple of years, right?
Well, going to what Bill was saying about the fractionation, if that's a word, of the American media and the sources of content, whether it's music or news. I mean, maybe we are in I guess the academics or philosophers talk about a postmodern era where you no longer have single authoritative reference points. If that's the case, and if people are much more independent in where they get their news, where they form their ideas, it seems to me that actually supports the idea that the era of very big government, very large state expenditures, may in fact have to be reconsidered at least at the margins. And now, nobody thinks we're going to go back to 1890 outside the Cato Institute. But whether I think the question is whether there is a real margin for adjusting the size of government expenditure. And this, we talk about tax issues, and Mitch McConnell's very strong view that yes, tax cuts have to be retained, hopefully extended to small businesses, hopefully extended to the middle class. And I think this actually is the tip of a much larger issue, and that is can we put the idea of the large state, large government expenditure onto the table for possible revision? And you look at the government in the UK, the new coalition government, you look at the German government, you look at the French government, in those countries, this country and those countries, very big cuts in the state sector are being contemplated and executed at this time. And these are countries that we think of as being much more attached to an idea of the big state. So is it really that extraordinary that some segment of America's electorate is also contemplating that sort of thing?
What's extraordinary is that Bill Clinton declared the era of big government to be over back in the early 1990s, and it's still there. If anything, it's bigger.
But in fact,
despite Republican...
to be accurate, the government did not grow as the size of GDP for a long period of time. It began to grow in the 2000s and took up with the two wars that were unfinanced, the new Medicare Part D prescription drug program, and then the extraordinary efforts, most of which are short-term and will not have the impact on the long-term budget. The real problem has to do with healthcare costs and an aging population. One of the sad things about the Tea Party is that they have a visceral desire for limited government and smaller government, and you can understand that. But they don't really have a clue as to where the money goes. That is to say, they support Social Security and Medicare, maybe trim back defense a little bit. You gotta pay the interest burden on the national debt. I mean, you're fighting over, you know, 1/6 of the budget, which Obama's already frozen. There's no policy direction or content. This is visceral.
I just want to throw in a little anecdote. In 2004, I did an hour-long documentary called Southern State of Mind, looking at how the South is the cauldron of American political change, still, all these centuries later. And I interviewed Merle Black. Who's a professor.
They're two.
The two of
them. Twin professors of history, and this is the one at Emory. And he was reminiscing about his boyhood in Louisiana. And the South, which hates big federal government, it hates it because it was occupied by the federal army after the Civil War, and it hates it because now they got to pay a lot of taxes. In the middle bit, in the Depression, they loved the federal government because Franklin Roosevelt shipped so much money down there, paved the roads, brought in electricity. And Merle was telling me that he was a roustabout on oil rigs in Louisiana. He said, and he worked with all of these young men whose entire lives depended on the federal government providing the aid and succor to their parents in the 30s and 40s. And they finally got jobs. And they thought, I'm making so many thousands of dollars a month. They get paid well on the oil wells. And then they saw how much money was being held back in taxes. And they hated it. And they never made the connection between, well, you know, you have to pay to get the service. And I think that underlines a lot of it. I just want to spin this around because I thought Bill was going to get there. We're having a fairly sophisticated conversation about the American economy and its relation to politics. Somehow, in Washington at the Brookings, on the op-ed pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post, this is what we talk about. It is not what people talk about who are going to go voting in 6 weeks. Right. And I want to ask about the media, if you think it's the media's fault, or do you think it's people's fault for not wanting to, take a risk and read something, listen to somebody other than Rush Limbaugh if they're Tea Partyites, watch Fox if they're Tea Partyites. Is it a flaw in contemporary American society, or is it a flaw in the mainstream media that has somehow failed to figure out a way to communicate the important stuff that's underlying our dilemmas?
I think it was always thus. I don't think most people sit around and ponder the details of tax bills and measures going through Congress.
I'm shocked.
Some of us do. Have pity on us.
What do they do then?
But most people, they want to get up in the morning and know that if they act and behave in a certain way, that people are going to act in a certain way back towards them and treat them in a certain way, that they can go to work and make a decent living for their children, that they can go with their children to the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts and to ballet and to piano and to soccer or whatever it is that they're playing. They aren't focused on political issues, and thank goodness they're not. I'm not sure I would like to live in a society that was totally peopled by people like us. It would. I don't think I would like that.
So you wouldn't move to a district with people who only voted the way you do?
I have, but I do think that there has to be. The fault lies, I think, with the leadership. Populism as an impulse is always with us, and it comes to the fore in certain times of crisis, whether it be of social change and cultural change, or whether it be economic crisis. The question is whether or not it's easy to demonize these people and to make fun of them and to look down on them. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. The wingnuts, yes, you can dismiss them, but many of these people are perfectly good, decent people. They need to be led. And they need to be led by leaders who can reach out to them. One of the great things, one of the great gifts that Bill Clinton had in dealing with economic change in areas that were in decline was to somehow or another communicate to those who were suffering that not only could he feel their pain, in that famous phrase, but that he was putting in place some programs, some activities that would somehow or another get them through. And I think the same thing is true even now, that somehow or another these people need to be led. They need to be, to some degree, educated. And I think in the end, that's the task of effective political leadership. We don't have as much of that right now as I think we need.
Well, certainly, I mean, there's a balance to be struck when you're in political office between being led by the voter and, to some extent, leading the voter. I agree with Bill on that. I mean, talking about the media, I mean, the media has a mission that most journalists I've met are deeply dedicated to, and that is to inform the public about the facts of whatever situation is foremost in people's minds at a given moment. But, you know, there's also the imperative that you grab people's attention. And Ms. O'Donnell in Delaware is kind of an interesting person. So it's not surprising over the last week we've heard a lot about her. But if you looked at this whole election season from high altitude, 80,000 feet, to get the big picture, I mean, there's some other races that are not talked about very much at home, not talked about at all overseas, but are pretty interesting. If you go to California, you've got two self-made, very successful women candidates. One of whom, we're talking about a self-made billionaire, Meg Whitman, and a self-made centimillionaire, Carly Fiorina, who, hey, look, you might not agree with their policies. They're sort of moderate centrist Republicans. I accept they may not be your cup of tea, but just as a personal story, they're kind of interesting people running for really important offices, Senate and Governor of California, and they both could win. Tough one for the Senate. Governorship looks like a... Anyway, those are kind of back page stories. And I do think that that's something where the media might be doing a little bit better job. Again, I understand why a very eccentric sort of newcomer can grab the headlines. But by the same token, I'm not sure that's a totally representative picture of all the truly interesting things that are happening on the political scene.
A quick word, Tom, then I'm going to throw it open to the House.
Yeah, I think what Bill is talking about is really the cable news phenomenon and how explicitly ideological they are. Fox on the right and MSNBC, and poor CNN is turned into this pathetic ambulance chaser. They just have no reason for existing or economic business plan that would allow them to continue. And so much of the communication is a matter of going and getting reinforcement. So I think that's where the concern on the media side is more than on the other.
How many people listen to NPR?
Exactly.
You know, there is good,
or the news hour.
There is good political coverage, and the point is that because the media is beholden to corporate values more than it is news values, we have this phenomenon of infotainment, where particularly television, but also the media, has to make money, and therefore it has to sell to the consumer what they think the consumer wants. And the consumer gives you Fox and all the rest of it.
But yeah, I'm kind of thinking out loud now about what we're talking about here about the media, and I'm wondering whether the period when you could watch Walter Cronkite on was it CBS, whether that is representative of how things were in North America for the last 300 years, or is it sort of a unique moment? And before then, I was just reading a couple months ago Charles Dickens' Notes from America. I mean, everybody knows the French version, but Mr. Dickens went to America in 1841. He wrote this very interesting set of reflections, and he talks about political life and all sorts of kind of crazy people talking to one another and not listening to anybody else.
Right.
You went and you got your own little paper, which had a circulation of 200, and then right down the street there was someone else with his own paper with a circulation of 210. Well, so that's how it was until about 1930-ish, I think. And it starts to make you wonder whether there was some coalescence of technology and society and economics that produced a 40 or 50-year period where, yes, you could dominate the airwaves because you're the one who owned the transmitter. And a transmitter was a huge piece of capital investment, and no one else was going to get in on that business. Now it's not so hard to communicate. I can do it with a computer. a couple $1,000s of equipment, and I can really communicate. So I wonder if that's kind of just going back to the way it had always been, and we'll adapt to it.
Except now you have the decline of newsprint, which is really serious.
That's an interesting point. We may come back to it. There's some other things we haven't got to, but maybe a question from the floor will get us there. Go ahead.
I have dual citizenship. I came to Britain in 18. I'm a British journalist. My family, my father was a lawyer, an anti-McCarthy lawyer. And this was my early childhood, and I left at 18, and I've been here ever since, and I'm a British journalist. I travel widely in the United States, but because of my upbringing, if I'm with people I don't know, I never mention politics. 2 or 3 months before the Obama election, I was with a whole group of people in New York. The hosts I knew very well, they were in their 80s. He was a professor of law at Yale. And at a certain point, he turned to me and said, "You and I have never discussed politics." And I was very uncomfortable. And he said, "I know why, because you're left of center, and you would instinctively know that we're all Republicans." And I said, "Yes, that's probably true." And I didn't say the obvious, which was if you've been brought up in the height and fear of the McCarthy era, you don't open your mouth in the United States without upbringing by instinct. And he said, "I want you to know something. I'm 82 years old and I'm voting for Obama." And I was startled. And he said, "I can't stand the party. I can't stand where it's gone." And everybody in the room said, Republican to man and woman, we are all voting for Obama. Now my question is, these are the people who interest me with the midterms coming up and the Tea Party, and wondering whether in fact those people will solidify to stay with Obama because of the Tea Party movement, or whether it will have no influence whatsoever.
You know, the percent of Republicans who defected to Barack Obama was not very large. It turns out it was a very polarized election. What happened is Obama did better among independents, the vanishing independents, and he got higher turnout among Democratic constituencies, and the two produced the results. There were some people like that. I was in some of the same rooms around Washington, and very outspoken Republicans who said, you know, we're not going to do that. But it is a fraction of the electorate, and for the most part, they are disenchanted. Some are business people who've decided Obama's been anti-business. Some are disappointed on other grounds, maybe his position in not delivering on Guantanamo or on other aspects of national security. So I mean, it's not that from 2008 to 2010 that there has been a dramatic shift in the underlying support bases. We were polarized then, we're polarized now. It's just that the independents tend to be referendum voters, not strongly attached to party. They'll vote against the party in power during tough times and stick with it when things are going relatively well. That's the sort of nature of the beast as I see it.
Another question, down front.
I hope you'll forgive my ignorance, but what are the issues in this by-election, and how much of the American public know well those issues?
Who wants to jump in on this?
Well,
go
I'm
ahead.
just tempted to go back to 1992 and repeat that famous phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," that Bill Clinton had posted up in his office. This is about the economy first, second, and third, I think.
But to add to that, it's not a matter of people having clear views about what direction to take or move on the economy. These are what we once called valence issues as opposed to position issues, you know, where you got the left fighting the right, different approaches to government. People are scared. They're concerned about unemployment and underemployment, insecurity about jobs, short-term and long-term, inadequate growth, and declining personal assets.
And as I was saying before, they've heard it all before, all the nostrums, all the, you know, what's going to happen if the Republicans win, what the Democrats have tried. And I think that's part of the problem. There is no real alternative that's shining through out there.
Well, I'd just like to throw it, I'm curious to know, when I first moved here and I get asked about American politics, I try to explain congressional elections often aren't about national trends, but they're about local and regional things. You get a guy who's a corrupt crook in a safe seat, he'll get thrown out anyway because he's been a corrupt crook, or he's failed to do this, or, you know, there's a local issue that really fires people up. But I get the sense, listening to everyone here, that that kind of regionalism is being bled out of American politics.
It is being bled out. The Democrats are very much trying to make the races in the House specific to the districts as much as they can, whereas the Republicans are trying to make it a referendum on Obama. But let me pick up on something that was said, is the economy stupid? I agree that it's the economy and the economic frustration and the economic fear and uncertainty that lends this election a certain piquancy, a certain force. But I think there's something else that motivates those who are enthusiastic about participating, the right wing of the Republican Party. And that is an uncertainty about change. I think human beings, by and large, many human beings are by nature unhappy with change. They want the world to be the same tomorrow as it was when they were young. And there are people who are experiencing change, demographic change in the U.S. The U.S. is looking different from what it used to be. If you remember the panels that appeared from the two parties in this past election, when the Democratic candidates were on the stage debating, there was a woman, there was someone of African heritage, there were a range of ages. When you looked at the Republican panels, it tended to be all male, all white, and all somewhat elderly. Not all of them, but most of them elderly. And in a sense, it's people who remember the America of the 1950s, who are increasingly uncomfortable in the America of the 2010 era. People who see the demographic changes taking place, people who think that the government is somehow or another favoring people who don't deserve to be favored. John Kennedy once made the comment about Latin America that the great hope in Latin America was that the middle class could be secure and could grow, because the middle class, when it grows and is secure, can be generous towards those that are below. When it is frustrated and frightened, it tends to push those below away. And there's an element of the American population that is below and who very much senses that and hates it and wants to strike out, and that's the impulse that you're seeing in this election, one of the impulses you're seeing in the election.
But yeah, to take a little bit of, maybe I'd like to distinguish a point or two that Bill made. If in fact the trends that we see are largely because people are afraid of change, then how do we answer, how do we explain that people are really concerned about incumbency? You have a government which has spent too much, and it's not just Democrats, not just FDR Democrats, but George W. Bush for 8 years ran up the biggest deficits that we had ever seen up to that point. His successor has now run up even bigger deficits. But it seems to me a lot of people are looking at Washington and they see a monolithic entity that, whether it's D or R, Democrat or Republican, it doesn't change at all. It keeps growing. It keeps the government more or less as a very, very large thing. So actually, I'm wondering maybe some of the so-called insurgency in my party actually is because people want real change. They do want to shake things up a little bit.
Well, it's interesting. The New York Times and CBS polled together, and their last poll came out last week, just in advance of the primaries. Now, basically, they asked a question on incumbency. 34% of those polled said their congressman deserved re-election. 55% said it was time for a new person. They rephrased the question to and in a different way, and I didn't copy out the language, but believe me, it's very clever. Rephrasing the question, it came to 12% deserve re-election, 78% say it's time for a new person. Now this is really upsetting the apple cart in American politics, because for a long time the power of incumbency has been, you know, it's impossible to unseat an incumbent. Once you get into the House of Representatives, it's like a job, it has been for many, a job for
But Michael, it's true people say that, but after all of the drama of throw these bums out, if you look at the primaries, you will find almost no incumbents got defeated. A handful in the House and the Senate, not historic by any means. And I will tell you that in this election, 99% of Republican incumbents will be reelected, and probably about 90% of Democratic incumbents will be reelected. Sort of people feel this viscerally. It's a way of showing complaint. But the fact is those same voters have strong partisan views and will vote in kind, in sync with those views, and in spite of the rhetoric. So it's not a let's throw all the bums out. The other useful information to see is just fascinating. Right? If you would think an electorate unhappy with things would like somehow to see people stop engaging in these partisan battles and sit down and talk reasonably to one another and work out some reasonable policies. Not true. And it ranks. It's the Tea Partiers. 80 or plus percent are opposed to politicians. They're politicians compromising. It's stick to your principles. 70% of Republicans, 55% of independents, and it's only Democrats that about 40% say stand by your principles. That is to say, the public, yes, is unhappy, but they don't provide a whole lot of help in terms of actually encouraging politicians, as Madison and his fellow framers of the Constitution instructed to sit down. People from very diverse constituencies and actually talk to one another. That was the strength of the Congress when it worked best, and now we see almost none of that. It's two ships passing in the night.
But doesn't it, I mean, I used to joke when there was a particularly egregious congressperson who I disagreed with, or national politician. It's a representative democracy, and stupid people deserve representation too. So that guy is stupid. So whatever. You wrote a book called, about Congress not working, and clearly it isn't working. But is it somehow not representative of the American body politic, American society as it exists in the present moment?
It depends how you define representation. It's sort of we're not talking about quality or intelligence. We're talking about a conception of the body they were elected to, and what its constitutional design and purpose and intent is, and their ability to try to engage in, through congressional hearings and floor debate and the rest, some genuine negotiation. That doesn't happen now because there's a war between the parties. That's why it doesn't happen, and the public may encourage that, and so Congress is representative, but it's dysfunctional and not accountable.
And it depends as well upon how you divide the body politic for purposes of representation. It goes back to the question that Tom raised earlier about reapportionment and the way we draw our congressional districts. Increasingly, we draw them as safe districts, totally Republican or totally Democratic, so you have none of these mixed districts where people have to appeal across lines. One of the things that happened in the South was that one of the great pushes, one of the great efforts was to create districts that would permit black representatives to be elected. The unintended consequence of that was you created some all-white, thoroughly Republican districts and some all-black or almost all-black districts, and those districts that had been mixed, that could have produced people who had to appeal to elements of both communities, they disappeared. and you've got this increased partisanship.
But it's interesting that these so-called majority-minority districts did result in more ethnic minorities being elected to the Congress, which, you know, if you look at the issue of what is a representative body from that line, it sort of worked, although I'm not a fan of them, but, you know, it did, in a sense, produce a more representative institution.
I want to get back out into the House. This woman back here has a question, please.
Hello. There are a whole load of things that are going on in my mind whilst you're talking.
Could you speak up, even though you've got the mic? You need to speak louder. Thanks.
Okay. When Obama came into power, when he was electioneering and going around telling people, one of the things he said that when he said that we can do it or we can make it happen, it wasn't just saying that he was going to do everything. It was saying that it was up to the people out there who had to do something and who had to help him to make the world a better place that they wanted. But what he faces is the same situation, is the same representatives, is the same political situation, is the same political situation, is the same economic situation. And when people say he's been there a year and a half or almost 2 years or whatever, nothing has happened, well, the world is not the same. When Roosevelt was around, you had more resources. There were still more things, more resources that could be discovered to help the world to become economically more comfortable and to create wealth and stuff like that. Now things the resources are being depleted. There are more countries that are coming up, like the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and so on. Much more people are using up the resources than there were when Roosevelt was around. So there are all these things about the world, talking about as if the world has to be the way it is. There has to be a complete philosophical change about how we see the world and what we want out of the world, and not to expect what we expect out of the world is so great, it's not sustainable. So how do you then expect one man to be able to deliver all this when the world is actually the same and the tools that he's using are actually the same, and how does it change?
Tom, from Washington, how does it change?
Listen, life is and policy is increasingly complicated in a large global community. Voters are myopic. They say, what have you done for me lately? We have come through and are recovering from the greatest financial and economic disaster since the Great Depression. I would support the argument that absent the steps taken in the U.S., initially by President Bush with TARP and continuing with President Obama, and the coordinated steps of the G20, we could well have fallen into a global depression that would make these look like boom times in all of our countries. But that's a counterfactual, and it's very hard for people to sort of cling to. We also know from academic research that recessions caused by financial crises almost invariably take many more years to recover from, that job recovery is slower, that the growth of the economy is slower. The fact is that, you know, at the worst of this time, when what Obama inherited was losing 700,000 jobs a month. And you get it on the upside. It's small, it's modest, but that's a big change, you know, from a 6% decline in GDP to 1/4 of 5, or whether it's 3 or 2.5 or 1.5. It's better, but it's going to be pretty disappointing for a long period of time. There are a whole host of reasons for that, but it's a reality that puts special pressure on politicians like Obama who promised change and who spoke in such naive political terms about an era of post-partisanship when, in fact, the partisanship was so wired into the body politic that it, in effect, worked against him because he made a promise he was in no position to deliver. He could make his gestures, but he couldn't deliver it.
I've got a question. There's a gentleman back there, and then I'll take this woman here. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm curious about, why the Tea Party now in this age is proving to have such popularity. It's been very interesting to hear the panel's comments about the historical instances in American history of small media operations and so forth. But I'm wondering about recent history with the George Bush election in 2000, which was a very narrowly won victory, and which actually he almost didn't have a defining moment until 9/11. And then that really has defined the Bush presidency. What I want to ask is the Tea Party reaction to the fact that the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which has sometimes been called 9/15 in American parlance, is actually challenging what America stands for? It's an existential question almost. Because, as the gentleman from the Democrats in the UK has said, we can't actually take the bankers out and get at them. Whereas in the war on terror, George Bush launched in Afghanistan and Iraq a very clear war that killed lots of people. So is the Tea Party...
It's the existential question that you're getting at.
Is the Tea Party a reaction to the fact that it is a recession, but it's a recession where you can log on to the internet and see that China had 8% growth in the last 6 months. So it's different. So what does America stand for?
Okay, let me put that to Tom first.
Well, look, I think that when typically, if you take a person who's of a conservative persuasion, who is concerned about the size of government, the size of the tax burden, and she looks at the 8 years of Republican presidency from 2001 to 2009, and sees that during that time, spending increased, size of government increased. In fact, some fairly intrusive aspects of government grew, USA Patriot Act and that sort of thing. It's not that surprising that within the Republican part of the electorate, people began to scrutinize their own primary candidates very carefully and indeed unseat some incumbents. I'm not sure if it's an existential crisis, but I do think it is a sense that the size and scope of government in Washington has reached a point a long time ago, where it is very difficult to have any meaningful change unless you really get a little bit angry about how things have been conducted in Washington. So I think the Tea Party movement has to do with a frustration at a political system that just hasn't seemed to be able to move, whether it's a Democrat president or a Republican president. Changes that we've seen in a generation are rather incremental changes at the margins, rather than any real reconsideration of how you run a government.
I'm going to ask that later.
I have two questions. One is, first, I'm a journalist. I work for MSNBC.com, which, incidentally, is an editorially independent, is not part of cable. I only say that because people assume we are. Anyway, as an online presence, I spend an awful lot of time with what is called our community. And one thing that strikes me about this the Tea Party in the last 2 years is frankly the racism. And I'd really like you all to discuss that, because I didn't expect it. This is a country that elected Barack Obama, and the bigotry, I can't even put it into words, frankly. It's quite striking and frightening. And my second question is, and so I just want to know where that comes from. Is that simply people who are scared resort to racism and bigotry? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. My second question is, we have the Tea Party on the right. Is there going to be something on the left? The real IRA a few days ago came out and said it's going to go after bankers. Are we going to, something equivalent going to happen in the United States?
Didn't Osama try that?
Oh my God.
No.
Are they going to use AK-47s?
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think Blackwater dudes are doing now that they can't operate in Iraq? They escort them back to Greenwich. You're joking. I got cut off by one in the city of London the other day. Jaguar, you know, there's a space for my Volkswagen. I went in front, I went behind. Suddenly I had this enormous Land Rover giving me all kinds of unpleasantness. And I knew that they were armed bodyguards, and I had cut in front of the Jaguar. Well, you know, you guys don't know how to. I mean, it's out there. It's real. But let me come back to. I hate to keep throwing all this stuff over to Tom, but you know, Tea Party, they're your cousins. So I'm going to throw the racism to Tom, and then to Bill, because he's from the South, and he'll have something to say about this. Right. But let's go with Tom first, because what is the latest? What was that polling figure that we saw? 22% of Republicans think that Barack Obama is a Muslim, for example. And that's your party.
It's higher now, yeah.
And it goes by the week. I mean, you know, so I mean, these are things that, you know, a moderate Republican has to deal with within his own party. Yeah? Sorry.
Yeah, Tom.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for giving me the first go at that question. Thank you for the question. It's very well formed. Content was okay as well. As we said before, both parties are coalitions, sometimes inchoate coalitions. There was this great historical shift by which a lot of very interesting and fun people to be with from the Deep South, who had been Democrats since the presidency of Jefferson Davis, became members of another party. That's part of how our party system works. They're very large parties. The Tea Party movement is pretty diverse. I don't have sociological data on why different people join the movement and what percentage. We can make a list of different reasons you might be a Tea Party adherent. Yeah. And unfortunately, very sadly, there are Tea Party people who are there because of race issues. I don't know what percentage of the movement is motivated by that sort of issue. My intuition is that the overwhelming majority of Tea Party people are very concerned about the size of government. The $1 trillion deficit has a psychological impact. It's my party's fault, because George W. Bush was the first guy to sign $1 trillion deficit, and then Obama happily signed, signed a second $1 trillion plus deficit.
For good reasons.
Well, perhaps short-term.
It
may well be that these were short-term good reasons, but the fact is these are deficits of World War II level as a proportion of the economy.
Not there yet.
Well, close enough. You know, give it another year. That my intuition is that's the prime moving force in the Tea Party movement. Are there people there who are just of a totally different viewpoint than I share, or anybody I really would want to associate with politically share? Yeah, of course. On the Democrat side, look at the coalition that brought the nomination to the then Senator Obama. Well, you know, there were fringe elements in that coalition as well. That's inherent in the American political process, that because you've only got two parties, effectively speaking, you're going to get strange bedfellows. Why is there lingering racism in the U.S.? Well, look, I mean, the Swedish right seems to have just had ascendancy in the last couple of days, and I guess there's some fairly nasty retrograde people in that party as well. So it's not just an American phenomenon, it's a transatlantic phenomenon. Again, I think to find a Tea Party rally where people are saying really evil, crazy things, it's noteworthy, it's newsworthy. I'm glad it's on the front pages. We should air this and communicate this. But there's also there's a tendency for a good story to sort of exaggerate the actual underlying political or sociological influence of the phenomenon.
Bill.
Let me deal with it in this way. One of the advantages of being a historian is it leads to a certain degree of humility about your own time and place and circumstance. We tend to look back to the medieval period and think, oh, these people held these ideas that are so stupid. How could they possibly have believed it? But I often step back and ask myself, well, 300 years from now, people looking back at us, what ideas that we hold as true and that we accept are they going to think of as equally crazy, equally unfounded? So one of the things I would encourage you to do is always to step back, take a step back, and think through your own assumptions and stereotypes and preconceptions. And that's true for Tea Partiers and the groups that are there that are easy to make fun of, to point to, and to look down on. Be careful in the use of the word racist. There are indeed groups going back to the 1920s and the neo-Nazi parties of the 1950s and 1960s that I dealt with in my coming of age and politically and the rest. They're there, and they're part of any large society such as ours, certainly like ours. They're there, and they're part of the Tea Party. And they anecdotally you can point to them, and they do make the news, as Tom says. But many of these people are not necessarily in that category. They are people, however, who are susceptible to both some policy arguments that have a racial aspect to them, and to some personality arguments that have a racial element. By that I mean this. It's not for naught that when we were considering the health care bill, that all the studies showed that the health care benefits would flow disproportionately to those of Hispanic and of black origin. That's an element that was involved. It was never stated, it was never talked about, but it's an underlying reality. And there are people, a good number of people, who've worked hard all their lives, who are perfectly decent people, and many times can be appealed to their better natures, and they will exhibit those better natures. There are other times, especially in hard times economically, when they're frustrated and frightened, when the worst aspects of their ideas come out. And the Republicans, some elements within the Republican Party, have done a very good job of painting Obama as other, the other. He's different. And he is different in many ways. In reality, he's different. But even in producing falsehoods that are clearly false. To come to Tom's defense about the 22% that believe he's a Muslim, 22% of the American people believe an awful lot of strange things. So don't necessarily take that as all that damning. But so I would urge you to step back and be a little reluctant to label everyone involved there with that kind of label, but be well aware that those groups that do fit that category, that are vicious racist, and have been for decades, they are there as well.
Bill, I'm just going to stop you for a second. And Robert McKeever completely agrees with everything that's been said by everyone tonight. but he has London transport issues to deal with in order to get home tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael.
We've got about 2 more minutes. I'm going to turn to Tom Mann just for a second to finish up on that point. And then we'll have, if you want to stay for one more question, I've got one last one. And this is the prediction one. So,
I just wanted to say that I really agree with Tom's statement about the Tea Party and racism, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there are many sources of attraction and energy to a very disparate set of groups. There is no Tea Partiers, and you've got some people who are hangers-on, who are former Montana militias and former Birchers as well, but that's not what the vast bulk of the citizens involved. And Bill really made a similar point. I'd put it this way. In 2008 vote, Obama did better, basically, in every part of the country except rural white South. That reflects a legacy that isn't going to change overnight. We elected our first African-American president. I mean, it was extraordinary. And right now, more than 50% have favorable views of him at a very difficult time, and his approval ratings run between 45 and 47% right now. Gallup is at 47 now. Reagan, at a comparable period during a difficult time, is at 38, and Bill Clinton was about 42 or 43. So in spite of, he is strange. He has a funny name, you know, and we haven't had that experience. And so you're going to get some it's going to pull out some genuine racists whose numbers are declining, but they have by no means disappeared. But the one element of the Tea Party, especially some of the things that happened as a motivating force initially, was a a resentment of a big intrusive government, especially a government that seemed in the mortgage foreclosure effort to ward off that, and with the health care, with the subsidies as part of it, that somehow our hard-earned money is being taken and given to people who are undeserving, who don't assume the responsibility that is required, and we all agree that all Americans should assume. And that can take on a racial coloration, as Bill suggests, but it needn't be, because they have the same feelings towards whites in that respect.
It's interesting. We're going to have to wind up. We're just getting heated up. But it's interesting. The one thing we didn't get to, and I fear we're not, but perhaps people can just think about it, is I'm troubled as much by the rhetorical. The focus is on Tea Party, but I mean, look, the rhetorical nature of discourse in America can only go in one direction, and that's a bad direction. And I do wonder how American society can rescue itself. My experience covering Northern Ireland in the 90s was every time the peace process got to here, the rhetoric would heat up to here. And it would get hotter and hotter and hotter until, as happened on one occasion, a Protestant man and a Catholic man who were lifelong friends were gunned down because the rhetoric only could imply violence. And my concern as we approach these elections is that the rhetoric in America can only go in one direction. It's a deep concern I have. But what I need to do is wind this up, unfortunately. And so the money question, and we'll do a round robin, is on the 10th anniversary of Bush v. Gore, what's the election going to be like in 6 weeks? Who's going to win? What, and in a sentence, what does that project us forward to the presidential campaign in 2012? And why don't we just start with the partisans, and Tom can wind it up. So, Bill, if you would go first.
Okay, I'll do it, but let me do one little thing first, and let's leave you with a thought from yesterday's Evening Standard. The Evening Standard doesn't usually quote Einstein, but they did yesterday afternoon. And this is what they quoted him as saying: "You cannot fix a problem with the kind of thinking of the people who created the problem." That's what the Democrats have got to sell if they're going to lessen their losses in the election. So if we listen to Einstein, we'll do better than perhaps predicted. I think we'll lose 6 or 7 seats in the Senate. Retain control there. The House is more problematic. My hope is that we'll lose about 36 and remain in control, but I think there's a very realistic possibility that it would go slightly above 39. We should have the potential for a true wave election. I think that'll dissipate a little bit as we move towards the voting day, but nonetheless that potential is still there.
Well, there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of enthusiasm out there. I wish I had seen some of that in 2008 when I was working for John McCain, but we're seeing it now. I think there's going to be high turnout, especially on the Republican side. I think the House will turn Republican. I think the Senate's going to inch toward Republican majority, but we're not going to have a Republican Senate majority. But this is fairly conventional wisdom. You asked about the implications for the 2012 elections. The first thing we know is that the minute the polls close on the first Tuesday in November this year, the tea leaves will be out. It's going to be a mass collective exercise in tea leaf reading. If you have a if you have a Republican win, I think that the ball's in our court then. And we've got to play the hand the right way, to mix metaphors, cards and tennis. But we've got to make sure that we act in government between January 2011 and the next in the nominating process in a way that instills confidence in the Republican Party and builds some momentum for a Republican change in the White House in 2012. Also, we didn't say anything about governor's races. I think we're going to pick up some I think we're going to do pretty well. I think we're going to do very well at that level. And governorships are important proving grounds for executives, and that's important for the Republican Party because you want to start developing talent at that executive level so we have a strong field for potential future presidential runs.
There's there's really broad consensus on what's likely to happen in November, which is the Democrats holding their majority, but losing it, holding it in the Senate, but losing it in the House. It's not, the latter is not certain. The big effort of Democrats is to change the frame of the election from a referendum to a choice. But alas, during bad times, it's always a referendum, so this will be breaking history if they succeed in doing so. But my final comment goes to your last observation, Michael, as well as Tom's on the implication for 2010. I think you're right about the rhetoric intensifying, but I think what you will see happen is that Obama will gain politically from a Republican takeover of the House. John Boehner is a good legislator, but he has no power at all. He's running to get in front of his caucus, and Eric Cantor and Mike Pence and others are prepared to take him down. But he has no room to compromise. He will try not to shut government down, but I bet you it happens because of the demands from the party. And Obama can sit back and say, why are we doing this? Let's lower our voices, and and so he will try to lower the rhetoric, all the while steaming up the Democratic activists for the 2012 election. My own view is that a Republican victory in 2010 will make even more likely an Obama victory in 2012. Of course, the latter requires GDP growth gets north of 3% and unemployment gets south of 8% for that to happen. But what is going on in the Republican Party now with the presidential nominating process is, I think, the potentially serious candidates are staying in Beijing as U.S. ambassador, like John Huntsman or Mitch Daniels, sort of quietly, staying where he is, and it's being overtaken by the Sarah Palins, who will never forgive our dear friend John McCain for putting Sarah on the political map. But I just think the energy and vitality is going to be on the right of the Republican Party, and they're going to make it a bit easier for a Democratic president to be reelected.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much to my remaining guests. This is Bill Barnard, Thomas Mann, and Thomas Mann. Thank you all very much for staying here. I hope you learned something.